Hello again and welcome to the video about Backup2Go. So Backup2Go is Archiware's workstation backup product. It's the last module in this series of videos that I'm going to cover. So let's draw a little picture and understand what Backup2Go can do for us. So Backup2Go is a workstation backup product and requires that you have a backup server, which is just an installation of P5, same software that you use to do all the different tasks across all the different modules. And your backup server will be sitting on your local area network, or maybe a DMZ network off of a firewall, and there will be some storage allocated, and this storage is where the workstation's backups will be saved. So within here there will be a folder allocated to Backup2Go as its storage repository. You can actually have more than one different storage repository and assign different attributes to backup in different ways, but we'll cover that when we go through the user interface. And then within each of these folders, each workstation will get its own folder, and then within that folder we will manage a file structure that will consist of both the backups from the workstation and also the historical snapshots from the workstation over time, and we use file system links to achieve that. So it's worth pointing out that this folder where the backups are stored is really something that should only be managed by Backup2Go, and you shouldn't go delving in there yourself and accessing files because you don't really know what you're looking at because of the way the sim links link things together. So you've got your backup server, this is your local area network, and then hanging off of this there are going to be the workstations that you're backing up. So there might be laptop machines, there might be desktop machines and so on hanging off the LAN. So you could be backing up machines in the office or in the school lab or wherever. And additionally, if the network location of the backup server is exposed publicly via some firewall, some routing configuration, and a public IP and maybe public DNS names. So you might want to configure a name like backup2go.company.com, and then that makes it easy for workstations to be configured to back up to your Backup2Go server. And then if I draw a dotted line here indicating this is a wide area connection to a remote network, could be somebody's home, could be anywhere, then that means that machines located remotely can also back up to the same Backup2Go server. So what we're saying is that you can provision a Backup2Go server and make it available either over the LAN, or depending on how you set it up, it could be that you're allowing workstations to back up over the internet to your backup server, and that's particularly useful where you have machines which are belonging to employees who are mostly out of the office, so they may be saving files onto their local machines that you want to get back and that you want to have backed up. If you want to additionally back the workstations up to tape, then what you would do is employ the backup module, which is covered in a different video, backup module, and then that would allow access to tape storage, for example, so that you could then take the backups of the workstations and also replicate those backups onto tape, and that might allow you to hold more historical backup data than you have room for on disk. The reason that we don't back up a workstation directly to tape like that is because a tape drive requires a reliable continuous data stream coming in from the source of the data, so in this case a single workstation, and workstations typically get switched off, the lid of a laptop gets closed and the workstation will sleep, and that isn't suitable for writing data back to tape. So the Backup2Go product is designed to cope with the workstation's network connections maybe being cut off, maybe changing, and it's able to pick up where it left off and continue the backups at the next opportunity. So that's one of the main design features behind Backup2Go, is its ability to cope with workstations that are coming and going on the network and still manage to get proper backups of those workstations. The configuration of Backup2Go is really pretty simple compared to the other products where you have to do quite a lot of management of storage and volumes, etc. So let's kick off by logging into our instance of P5 running on this Mac here. And if we flick over to the Backup2Go module, you'll see that the configuration for Backup2Go consists of just something called workstation groups and then workstations. So the way it works is that a workstation group is a set of settings that you can define that describe how one or more workstations are going to be backed up. So you need at least one workstation group, also described here as a template, in order to start backing workstations up. So you configure that, and then you go to your workstations, you install the exact same P5 software on those Windows and Mac workstations, and then you use a special separate web interface that allows the workstation owner, so this is a non-technical person that's not going to have any understanding of the administration side of the product, this web interface will allow them to configure their backup, run backups, monitor backups, and then restore from their backups. So it's very simple, and it's just focused around those simple tasks. So let's take a look first of all at the template or the workstation group settings. So if I double click on this template, which is created by default when you install the product, and this one is fine to start configuring, first thing I'm going to do is enable this template because we're going to want to use it. And the next thing I do is provide a data storage directory. So I can click the browse button as you've seen before, and I'm going to create a folder on my desktop, new folder, and I'm going to call it Backup2Go storage. And when I create that folder, you'll also see it pops up on the desktop here, so we can be sure that that's been created. And if I select that folder, then get the full path to the folder here. So this folder is going to contain the workstation backups from all the workstations that back up to this template. So if you had 5 machines, each with a 1 terabyte hard drive, and they're 50% full, and you're going to back up the whole machine, so that's half a terabyte times 4 workstations, 2 terabytes. And if you're additionally keeping data for 1 week or 2 weeks or whatever you choose here, that means that as files are changing on that workstation, each time the workstation gets backed up, we back up the latest version of changed files, and we'll also keep previous versions of files for the number of days that you're specifying in this retain data menu. So this selection that you see here has a big impact on the amount of storage that you're going to need. So you really need to think about the directories that you're going to back up from the workstations, how many directories, how quickly that data is changing, to assess the size of storage that you're going to need to perform the backups that you want to have running. So just something that you need to think about. So let's leave that on the default setting. I'll apply the changes that I've made so far. So these two settings up here where we specify the storage location and how we're going to manage that storage in terms of data retention are in a separate block in the UI here, and those two settings need to be made at this point by the administrator. Now the interesting thing about the way templates work is everything in the box that I'm highlighting here at the bottom, where it says predefined workstation parameters, this is where we define things like which folders are we going to back up, file filters to remove certain files from the backup, how frequently we back up, do we do compression, encryption, and so on. So this is really the description of how and what we're backing up from the workstation. And the way it works is that either you make the decision in the template and then that fixes it for all of the workstations using this template, or you leave it blank and then the workstation itself gets to decide within its own web interface. So you can see all of those drop down menus where it says workstation decides. That's the default unless I make a decision for each one of those settings. So let's start by looking at the directories to back up. This is simply specify a path and click the add button to add it to the list. You'll notice that there's no browse button here because we are kind of describing directories on hypothetical workstations, and so this list of directories will apply to all the workstations that are being backed up, and therefore it's possible to use wildcard characters where question mark describes a single character and the asterisk describes a sequence of characters. So in the example here, if you wanted to back up just the documents folder for all the users on a given workstation, you would use the asterisk character to replace the user's username part of the path. So I'm just going to, in order to demonstrate this to you, I'm going to back up the users library folder just as an example. So I'm going to specify users and then all users and library, and then add that to the list. So every user, they have a library folder. That's what we're going to back up from each of the workstations that we're backing up. So you can add more entries to this this list by typing them in here and hitting the plus button. Over here then we have file filters. We currently have no file filters defined on the server. I'm going to cover that in the advanced video. So if there were file filters, we could select them. Backup interval, pretty straightforward. The way that this works though is when the software is installed on the workstation, first time it's configured and set up to point to the server, you get the option to start the backup then. Once that backup's completed, the next backup will be scheduled for 4 hours on from that point in time. So it's not like a take backup where you tell it to run at midnight each day. This backup will try and run at this 4-hour interval, but it may well be that the workstation might be switched off at a point where a backup would normally run, in which case when the workstation is next awake and alive and able to run a backup, it will run a backup as soon as it can once the 4-hour interval has passed. So again, this setting has a big impact on the amount of storage you require, because if you're retaining data for 1 week and backing up every hour and files are changing every hour, then there may be hundreds of versions of files being stored in the backup. So be careful not to set the interval too frequently, because you might run out of storage as a consequence of that. File system events, I would say yes to that. File system events is the operating system event log that we query to determine where changes have occurred, so where we need to back files up from. Same thing that Apple's Time Machine uses, so that's that one. CPU throttle. This avoids the Archiware process using too much CPU. Possibly might be necessary to set this on older machines. I would say on modern machines that's not something that you probably need to worry about. I'm going to set that to 100% so that that's hardwired and the workstations don't get to change that one. Whether or not we back up on battery power, so we're able to determine if a laptop is running off of its battery and maybe not back up to conserve battery on machines being powered by the battery, and then when they get plugged into the mains then the backup could begin. Compression and encryption, pretty straightforward. If you're going to be backing up over very slow links, then compression might help. I would generally say default to no unless you're sure that that's something that you want. Encrypting the data transport. This is something that might be necessary if you're allowing a workstation to back up over an open internet connection. If you don't enable this, then the workstation's files are going to be being transmitted across the internet in plain text effectively. So that's something that you might want to enable in those situations, but it's going to require some CPU to do the encryption at both ends, so it might be more noticeable to the workstation owner when their backup's running if you're doing encryption as well. Limit bandwidth, self-explanatory. We'll measure the speed of the connection between the workstation and the server and then attempt to use some percentage of that speed. I would use this one if you're experiencing network problems perhaps, but otherwise I'd probably leave it on 100% so that the backups complete more quickly than they otherwise would. And the network mask setting, there's a little help tip here. You can specify a subnet mask where you want the backups to run from. So this means if you were on, let's say, this 192.168.234 subnet in the office and you specify that subnet mask you can see here, then backups will only run when a computer has an IP address in that subnet and therefore is likely to be in the office. So you could maybe set the office subnet and a user's home subnet that they have on their home broadband connection, and then backups would run at home and in the office, but not anywhere else. So that's quite a useful setting, and you can comma separate more than one value in that list. Okay, so that's a quick run through of the workstation parameters. So if I apply those changes and now close the window, we now have a template that workstations can use when they connect to the server to perform their backups. And what will happen is this is the default template and will be used, because it's the generic template, and will be used by new workstations connecting to the server to back up. Once a workstation has connected the first time, it's possible to assign them to different templates, so we can use the new button down here to create a second template, give it a name, and each template can have its own data storage directory, so you can use more than one disk in that case to put some workstation backups on one disk and some on another disk. So when the workstations connect, in this case they're going to use this default template, and once a workstation has connected, we'll be able to see in this currently empty workstation list, we'll be able to see the ID, description, IP address, host ID of each workstation that connects, and then within the overview section here we'll be able to see a list of the workstations again with some traffic light indicators to tell us if the backups have run recently, if they've been successful when they last ran, etc. So we've done all of the setup required on the server to connect a workstation now and perform a backup. So the next step will be for us to move over to a laptop machine and configure the laptop to back up to the server. Okay, so here we are on our workstation laptop. This is a Mac laptop, and on this machine P5 has been installed, and you can see on the desktop after installing P5 you get this server admin and workstation admin shortcut, web shortcut to the relevant pages for administering the server and for also administering a workstation. So if we click the workstation admin link here, we bring up the Backup2Go Web Interface, and by default the Backup2Go Web Interface will not require you to log in if you're accessing it from the machine where P5 is running. So if you're accessing it via localhost, then you don't need to log in. Now the P5 Backup2Go Web Interface is very simple and cut down compared to what you've seen in the other videos. Basically consists of backup and restore over on the left hand side. Restore not currently available because we're not hooked into the server yet, so it is possible to do a restore without doing a backup if perhaps you've replaced your laptop with a new machine. Once you've connected to the server, you could start by doing a restore of some data from the backup server back to your machine before you do any further backups. So over here we have a setup button that allows us to go and connect ourselves to the server. So the first thing that we need to figure out here is whether we're doing a backup or a restore. So we don't have any backups on the server yet, so I'm going to do a backup. And then I need to choose the backup server that I'm going to use. So there is a Bonjour browser in this menu that allows the workstation to see over the local area network any backup servers that it could use to back up. And you can see that we've located the MacBook Pro server that we set up a second ago. Or you can enter the IP address of the server itself. So in the case of so I'm going to use the IP address of my server, which I know to be this, and then you need to have a login on that server that you can that is unique to you, that your backups will be stored on the server through that login, and you'll see in a while why that's important. So I'm going to use my P5 demo account, and this is the password to connect, and then I hit continue. And at this point, if there was any problem connecting to the server from the workstation, then you would get informed about that at this point. So if you now move on, as I have, to the setup complete screen, then it means that everything's good so far. So now the only further choice that you need to make, given that the template on the server has defined everything about the way this backup's going to run, is do I want to start a backup now, or do I want to let the software wait a while and then perform a backup a little later on? And if you're configuring lots of machines at the same time, it's probably best to say start later manually, and then the backups will get spread out over time rather than all starting at the same time. But for the purposes of showing you how this works, I want to start my backup now. I hit continue, and you can see backup is starting. The backup can be activated or deactivated via this tick box here, and you can see the workstation ID of 10,001 has been assigned to this workstation, so that will match up with the workstation ID in the workstation list back on the server. Now the folder I'm backing up is pretty small, so a few seconds later that backup has finished, and you can see because we configured a 4-hour gap between backups, then the next one's going to run at 15:36. There's a button here to start another backup straight away, but otherwise all I'd need to do now is close the browser window and leave the product to back my machine up every 4 hours, and it will happen by the software running in the background. Much like Time Machine, you probably won't notice that the backup is actually taking place. Now you'll see over on the left hand side, because we now have a backup completed, we have a restore area where we can go and browse our indexes. So the indexes are stored locally on the workstation, which means that browsing the indexes doesn't require a connection to the backup server. When you've selected something that you want to back up, then the file will be pulled from the server back to your workstation. So if we look in users, you can see that because we use that wildcard to specify the directories to back up, we have our admin user here and the user. We have a user called user. And then if we look in the admin user, we see the library folder that we backed up, and then within that folder we'll see all of the subfolders that are contained, and we could drill down and ultimately find some files in here that we could elect to restore. So the restore process is pretty simple. We just go to the folder that we want to restore, and we say either restore, which will restore the folder back into its original location, with the conflict set to not overwrite newer with older, or you can choose the restore to button, which gives you some options of where you want to place the files back. So for example, we could choose to restore files back to a specific folder somewhere on the machine that we're restoring to. So if I were to trigger a restore back to the user's desktop folder, then you can see the product says that the restore is started in the background, and it's possible to use this button here to monitor the restore process in much the way as you're able to monitor jobs on the administration interface on the server. So that's how you do a backup and a restore. One other thing to point out is this palette over here on the right hand side. This is the thing that allows you to browse back and see historical snapshots of data from your workstation and restore a file maybe from yesterday. So currently we have the last backup, which ran at 11:36 today, and if I go back to the backup tab and trigger another backup, it may be that nothing's changed in the folders that we're backing up. We'll see how much gets saved. Once that backup's finished, if we go back to the restore tab, we'll be able to see a couple of entries in there, and then we can flick between those two different snapshots. So let's do that now. So now you can see there's an 11:36 backup and an 11:40 backup, and then within each of those backups we could probably find files that were different between the two. Okay, so that's how the backup looks from the perspective of the workstation owner. Very simple. Let's go back to the server now to see how we can manage and see who's been backing up now that we have a backup completed. So back on our server again, under the Backup2Go tab, the overview section now shows me that I have a workstation ID of 10,001 for this machine home backup Mac Mini. That's the name of the machine that was backing up. Last backup, green light, OK. Evidently the last backup, the second of the two backups that we took, didn't find anything to save. And again, the last successful backup is shown in the list as well. So you can see if the last successful backup was a week ago, then it would show you an amber or a red light to indicate that the last successful backup is probably longer ago than you might be comfortable with. If we move to the workstation list down here, then again we get a list of each workstation. This time we can also see the last IP address that we saw the workstation connect from. So from here you can tell if the machine was on the LAN or if it was off roaming on some other network. The host ID is the way that we identify the machine as being the same machine each time it connects, because obviously the IP address may change, the description or the name of the machine may also change, but the host ID is generated by P5 on each machine on which it's installed, and it's derived from the MAC address of the Ethernet adapter on that machine. So the host ID will not change on a given piece of hardware. However, if the hardware changes, then you may find that the machine will no longer be known to the P5 Backup2Go as the same machine, in which case it's possible to patch in a new host ID when a machine is changed, and then that machine will be linked up with the correct backup again on the server. Now, from this list, what we can do is we can double click on a given workstation, and that will bring up the info window where you can see the workstation's description, and you can see which template that the workstation is attached to. At this point, if you had created a second template, you could switch this workstation over to that template, and then the backups for this workstation would then behave as per that template's definition. You can patch in a new host ID by clicking in the host ID field. So if the machine does change, you can just patch in the new host ID having installed P5 on the replacement machine, and you can enable and disable this workstation. The other thing that you can do is you can make a one-off custom settings for this workstation by removing it from the template. So if we say none in this menu here and apply that change, then we get to set all of these parameters down here just for this workstation. So if you wished, you don't have to have the workstations managed by templates, but you can create separate settings groups for each workstation. So for example, you might change the folder that this workstation backs up to. So that way you could have several workstations each backing up to their own disk on the server. I'm going to reattach this one back to the generic template. Okay, so as far as the setup goes, that's pretty much it. You define your template, you attach workstations to the template, and then you allow the workstations to perform their backups, and then back on the server you can monitor those backups and see if everything's running smoothly. Now there's one other nice feature within Backup2Go which allows the restore area of the product to be used to access the backups of workstations. So you can see here I'm logged into the server as an administrator user, and I can see the workstation that is backed up listed here, and I can browse down the same directory structure, effectively browsing the index for this machine, and see the same files. But the difference here is that I'm not accessing this from the workstation itself. I could be accessing this via the browser from anywhere. And so instead of a restore button at the bottom, we get a download button. So if I select both of these files and hit download, my browser will download those two files via this folder, and in this folder you can see the two files that we just restored. So what this allows is that the owner of a given workstation can tap in the public IP of the Backup2Go server and access the administration web interface, log in as themselves, in which case they'll get a cut down interface. They won't be able to configure any of the products, but they will be able to go into the Restore Backup2Go tab and access their own backups, and if necessary download via the browser files and folders from their own backup. So this means that if somebody doesn't have their computer with them, they can use the Backup2Go server's web interface to access files from their computer. So that's quite a powerful feature, and it's kind of means that you can always get to important files from your computer wherever you are from the last backup that was taken with just by using a web browser. Okay, so that rounds up my my coverage of the Backup2Go product. I'll just finish up by pointing out that when deploying Backup2Go in a real environment, there is a special version of the DMG Mac installer which is a silent version of the installer, which I mentioned in the installation video. If you use that one, you can deploy P5 onto a bunch of workstations using remote desktop or other similar tools using that special package, which means that the software gets installed silently without any prompting on screen for installation options. And it's also possible to use a command line interface to remotely configure your Backup2Go workstations and point them to the server, and then therefore taking away the need for the workstation owners to do it via the web interface themselves. So it's possible to roll this out across workstations in an automated fashion without the workstation owners being required to do anything themselves, and that's particularly useful in maybe educational computer lab environments where the product's being used to back up a pool of machines that aren't owned by any particular one person. Okay, end of this video. Thanks for listening.